à tous et à toutes. Merci beaucoup d'être.
Good evening to all of you. Thank you for being here at this last session of the first day of the Ignatian spirituality. We're very happy to have you at this time before the end of this day. So the presentation we made by Father André Brouillette on the time movement, change, and encounter. But before presenting the speaker, I'm going to invite Jose to say a few words about how it works. There are things in English. You can have access to the interpretation for the English. So I'm going to explain this.
In order to choose a language, you just have to go on your screen, hover the mouse, and if you're on a computer, in the controls of the session, click on the button interpretation, and after that, click on the language you wish to hear. If you're on a mobile device, in your meeting controls, press the button with the three little dots or plus, depending on what you see, and then press language interpretation, and finally press the language, choose the language you wish to hear.
Another reminder is that the recording for this discussion will be shared later, 5 working days after this meeting. And that's it, Fanny. So our speaker, Father André Brouillette, is a Jesuit from Rivière-du-Loup. He's done his philosophy and theology and done systematic spirituality at this time at the Boston College in the States. He's the author of a book on Teresa of Avila, and his more recent book on the theology of pilgrimage, and called The Pilgrim Paradigm, called Faith in Motion in Paulist Press. So today we're going to listen to the pilgrimage in the Ignatian mode with Father Brouillette, and we're going to wait to the end for the question and answer period. Enjoy yourselves. Good afternoon. My name is André Brouillette. I'm going to present a reflection on pilgrimage as a time of movement, of change and encounter in Ignatian mode. So when we talk about pilgrimage, what we think is an idea of going out, of going toward another place, of just moving around, the idea of movement, of change, so that can, and what that can do for our lives. When people take the road of St. James of Compostelle, they choose to go in a certain freedom, in a certain letting go, a certain simplicity, a voluntary simplicity, to make themselves vulnerable, to make themselves open also to meetings that might occur along the road, meeting with the history, meeting with memory that's there, the meeting with persons with whom they might have touched or decided to walk with, people they're meeting on the road, and people that will help them on the road, who will welcome them. And finally, also a meeting with the Lord, or an encounter with the Lord, with something that goes beyond them, with the yellow arrows that show the road of Saint Jacques de Compostelle. People can go from one place to the next with an itinerary that is prepared for them and invites them to freedom of spirit along the road. So the pilgrimage, be it of Saint Jean de Compostelle or Saint James of Compostela or others, Santiago de Compostela, invites us to a discovery, to an otherness, to a displacement, to a moving, to an encounter also of the other. So my reflection today is nourished by the work, academic work that I've done, and which I'll finally published under the title The Pilgrim Paradigm. It's available only in English at this time, but it's a work that I develop more fully certain number of themes that we'll try and look at today. First of all, we can try and see what do we mean by pilgrimage in a more general way. Well, we have to see that the pilgrimage exists in different traditions, different religious traditions. We can think of Hinduism, where there are great pilgrimages bringing together millions of people to go on the Ganges River, or other types of pilgrimages also. So for the Shinto religion in Japan, there's also pilgrimages that are organized to go from one temple to the other, sometimes a certain number of pilgrimages, even in a circular manner. In Islam, of course, there's the pilgrimage has a very important role to play because it's even one of the pillars of faith. So normally, a Muslim, when he can or she can, when they have the means, both in terms of time and finances, must go to the Mecca once in his or her life. So there's something here that's part and parcel of the identity of the Muslim faith. And in the Jewish tradition also, there is also different pilgrimages that were done towards Jerusalem. So there's a long tradition there of pilgrimage, displacement with other persons on the road. We can also see that pilgrimages in the secular context, for example, in the time of Enlightenment, there was what they called a grand tour for the young aristocrats of Europe. There was the possibility of visiting different cities, to be touched, to contemplate the works of art, the architecture of the previous centuries, going through Rome, because it's sort of like a training session, if you wish, for these young persons. But also, I would say, there are pilgrimages that are secular, but the fact that it goes back to the place of one's ancestors. For example, there's a lot of Quebecers who want to find it. They read the genealogy and identify specific places in France or elsewhere, the place where their grandparents or their great-grandparents or their ancestors left. So we can do a pilgrimage of that way too, going back towards the place where our ancestors left. So we see this especially in North America, the idea of being able to go back to the sources. The Irish, Canadian Irish, or the Irish in the States go back to Ireland to taste the place where their ancestors left. We can also do pilgrimages in a secular way to give homage to a person that we appreciate. For example, to go to Montreal on the plateau to visit the places of the places that the author Michel Tremblay talks about, or to go close to a historical person that we admire. So the pilgrimage is not done only in a religious context, can be experienced also in a secular context. So to come back to the pilgrimage in a Christian context, we have to see that it never was an obligation for Christians to go someplace, though there is a tradition, a popular tradition, that's very rooted since the first centuries, to go to the tombs of the saints. That was an important event for the first Christians to honor these martyrs. So to go the place where they were executed, or simply to go to the place where they were buried. So this is how Saint Paul out of the walls in Rome, or the Basilica, St. Peter's Basilica in Rome, have this devotion where people go in pilgrimages to the place where the tomb of the apostles are. Also to Jerusalem. We know it's rather important since the 4th century of the Christian era. Christians went to Jerusalem to see the place where Jesus had lived or where he had worked and where he also had been killed and raised and arose again. So for certain churches, the place there that try and find their source and their rootedness at that particular time, at this old time. So normally, in the Christian pilgrimage, we go towards a place that symbolizes a person or was witness of an event linked to a person or an event of faith. For example, the apparitions in Lourdes or in Fatima, or even that have relics of a saint, of a particular person. We can think here of Brother André at the St. Joseph's Oratory in Montreal. We can also think of the Sanctuary of the Canadian Martyrs in Midland, in Ontario, which is both the place where a certain number of Jesuits were martyred, and also a place where we find relics of certain Jesuits who died there. So when we think of pilgrimage, I would say it could be interesting to look at the characteristics of this pilgrimage. What do we expect or understand by the word pilgrimage? Because there's different ways of doing pilgrimages. We can do them by plane to go in a given place. If you go in Holy Land, for people in North America, well, you have to almost take a plane. There are sometimes pilgrimages that can be done on foot. I talked about the Hajj, about the Saint Jean de Compostelle. When we go to Saint Anne de Beaupré in Quebec, very often we go by car. So it's another way of doing a pilgrimage. This is the same thing for Notre-Dame du Cap for Three Rivers. So the multiplicity of ways of living out the pilgrimage, both today and through history. 2,000 years of Christian experience. So I say there may be 10 characteristics that can help us to understand the phenomenon of the pilgrim. The first is the fact of wanting to go somewhere, because we can go on a trip, discover all kinds of things, people, places, cultures, the architecture, etc., etc. But a trip is not necessarily a pilgrimage, even if it's to visit the city of Rome or the Loreto in Italy, that are places of pilgrimage, but can simply also be places of holidaying. So we have to have an intention, we have to have a desire to be a pilgrim, a desire to be open to an encounter that goes beyond us, openness to transcendence. And I would say that's the second characteristic. So transcendence is the fact of being open to a greater than oneself. We can think here of God in a Christian context, or the communion of saints, those who have preceded us in faith. But transcendence can also be the belonging to a bigger group than religious. It could be a national group of which I am part, but is bigger than me, that it goes beyond, transcends history. A third characteristic is the role of memory in this, of history, because normally the fact of going on pilgrimage is to go towards a place which carries a certain history. It could be the memory of an important saint. It could also be, as I was saying, the memory of a familiar place. For example, if somebody goes to l'Île d'Orléans near Quebec, there are different places where you'll find things that say, there's little plaques that say, we came here, this is the first member of the family, and established themselves here in 1600 and something on this land. So people can to go there in pilgrimage. There is a memory of the past. So for the Americans, go to Gettysburg, which is the place of an important fight during the Civil War in the States. So there are like that places of memory that are important. So the pilgrimage connects us with the history, connects us to a memory which still has an influence on who we are today. To go to pilgrimage, we have to leave. That's pretty big. There's a departure. We have to leave the place where we are. We have to leave one's house and go beyond the threshold, try to go out so that we let go. Also a place that is very comfortable for us, to open us to a certain unknown, to different new possibilities. So it's important to see that the departure, the fact of leaving, is part and parcel of the pilgrimage itself. So the first step, after having spent time to prepare oneself physically, financially, materially, to undertake that pilgrimage. And then normally a pilgrimage also has a destination. In other words, we go somewhere. Sometimes there's certain pilgrimages that can be circular, but most pilgrimages are magnetized by a destination. In other words, we want to go to Saint James of Compostela. We want to go to Rome. We want to go to Lille. We want to go to Medjugorje. So there's something of the place of destination, of the sanctuary, that the place of destination that draws the pilgrim, that pushes them to go beyond themselves towards this particular place. So that's also important. I would say to know what is the destination of the place you want to go to, because there's a physical destination, but there can also be a more internal destination. In other words, one of transformation. And I'll come back on this. On the road now, a lot of things happen. And this too is important, because normally a pilgrimage will take time. There are some pilgrimages that can be shorter within the same city or the same area or the same country or something like that. That's something that can be done in one day. But there are pilgrimages that could spread out on many weeks, many months even. So what happens? What are the elements on the road that are important for a pilgrimage? Well, this is our sixth characteristic. One is embodiment, the fact of being embodied in our body. The pilgrimage obliges us to move out, makes us aware that our body, and then some limits of our body, or some people who are handicapped or pilgrimage, walking a pilgrimage will maybe not be possible for some people. It have to be adapted. But even for people who are very physically fit, if we have to walk, you'll feel in our body the tiredness, all the elements around us, the heat and the cold. So our environment will also play a role and influence us and touch us in our flesh. So there's something very embodied here, incarnated in the pilgrimage, especially when we look at the pilgrimage as an experience, a physical experience, where one moves. Also, I would say there not only embodiment, because we go to a certain place, the place that represents something. For example, when we talk about relics, there's the idea that the saint that we're going to see, for example, the tomb of Brother André at the St. Joseph's Oratory in Montreal, close to the crypt, there's something there that's very embodied. we know that the body of Brother André is present there. And at the same time, for Brother André, he's dead. He's passed away. But what connects us to him is not thought and prayer. It's also the material reality of my body, which encounters, I would say, his body, the body of the saint in this case, or the fact of being somewhere that has influenced the memory of Christians, the fact of being before the grotto of Lourdes, for example, where Mary appeared to Bernadette Soubirous. So the fact of finding ourselves in that particular place, that means that it touches us in our body. It's part of the pilgrimage. A seventh characteristic is that of vulnerability. The fact of finding ourselves in a different environment, of moving and of having less means than we usually have. We might have some financial means, but other means we don't have. And this reveals a certain vulnerability that we have. The fact that we need others to help us, to welcome us, to walk with us. But this vulnerability opens us also to a possible encounter, because we don't control the environment perfectly, and therefore this vulnerability opens a place to allow encounter of the other to occur. Eighth characteristic, there is an effort. There is an effort that's required by the pilgrimage. It could be a financial effort, it could be physical effort. It's interesting. Know that in the Middle Ages, actually, the pilgrimages had a certain penitential dimension. In other words, by the fact of walking on the road and having a certain number of difficulties on the road, to be exposed to the weather, the pilgrims wanted to pay for certain sins, some of their sins, as I said, and sometimes we could suggest or even ask them to undertake a pilgrimage for that particular reason of paying for their sins. So the effort, the fact that it be a bit harsh, contributes to this experience of pilgrimage. The ninth characteristic is that of the otherness. In other words, the presence of the other. There's a sort of social recomposition that occurs when people go on pilgrimage, be it in one group or even alone. You meet people on the road, you were helped out. There are people who can also bother us or not be very nice. So finally, we can undertake a pilgrimage alone, but we find out that pilgrimage puts us into a community in a different manner, a different way, even by the fact of going to a place that is associated to an event of faith or a saint. We enter more intimately in communion with that saint, that person, having seen the place, having touched the experience that they had had in that particular place. And a 10th characteristic is that of the transformation, a transformation of oneself. That's also a question of the pilgrimage. In other words, is the pilgrimage simply a parenthesis in our existence? A brackets, a little holiday here and a little holiday there, and then we go and come back and life continues? No, or else is there a transformation of our being that has occurred and that continues when the person comes back home? Has the pilgrimage of a value, a transformative value? These characteristics are not full for all pilgrimages that we might undertake necessarily, but I would say that they allow us to see what in our own experience is of a nature of a pilgrimage, and also what should we be attentive to make the experience of the pilgrimage even more fruitful. Because we want to look at the pilgrimage in an Ignatian mode, now I'm going to turn towards this Ignatian mode by different angles. The first angle is that of Ignatius of Loyola himself. It's from him that we have the word Ignatian, and when he was the founder of the Jesuits, so he lived in the 16th century. He was born in 1491, died in 1556. So in the 16th century, actually, where Europe is open up more to what it calls the New World. It's the time also where there's the Protestant Reform with Luther, Calvin, and the others. So it's a time of transformation. Quite important, actually, in this historical context. And so Ignatius himself is a pilgrim. And we have to see, how is he a pilgrim? First of all, we have a text that we call the text of the manuscript of the pilgrim, the pilgrim's the autobiography. It's maybe not an autobiography, but we'll come back on that. But in this text is one that's quite short, 100 paragraphs, and quite interesting also it's interesting to read. A lot of coming and goings that Ignatius tells us about it in this text. It's a text that he dictated at the end of his life to a Jesuit companion. So it's not really a text that Ignatius himself wrote, but it's something that came from conversations that he had with Luis Gonsalves de Camara, who was a sort of a secretary for him, also a Jesuit. And so he had these conversations with Gonsalves Camara, and after these conversations, at night, after supper, sometimes walking in the garden, well, Gonsalves would go and take notes down, and finally, we have the text that's accessible today. So, why is this text important? Why do we call it the story of the pilgrim? It's a text in which Ignatius tells about certain pilgrimages in that he experienced. First of all, for the 26 first years of his life, we don't have much information. It's really one sentence. Then for the last 15 years of his life, we also have very little information. Ignatius says, well, there are other persons who know what happened and who could tell you, and even better than me. So the text that we have, his manuscript or his testament, is between the wound, his wound in the Battle of Pamplus, to the moment where he comes to Rome, when he founds the Company of Jesus. So these are his formation years, very important for Ignatius. These years will be the years of this story. So at the beginning, Ignatius does not give his name in the text. Ignatius presents himself in the third person, he. And at the beginning is the one who is wounded, he who is wounded, the one who is sick. And progressively, he becomes the pilgrim. The pilgrim did this, the pilgrim did that, and he will remain the pilgrim until the end of the text, until the moment where he reaches Rome, and even beyond when he is in Rome. So Ignatius becomes the pilgrim, and he identifies himself as the pilgrim. So I'm talking about different pilgrimages. First of all, Ignatius, after the battle in Pamplus, he's wounded, He's brought back by the French to the castle of his family, and during a time of convalescence, he reads different works, and then at a given time, he feels the desire of changing his life, to follow Christ in a rather radical way, because he's a man who was ambitious.
Et donc, pour imiter le Christ,
So, in order to imitate Christ in all things, what better than going to the Holy Land, going to Jerusalem? And that's what Ignatius wanted to do, and what he did, indeed. So he went to Jerusalem and to live there like Jesus, very simply, eating herbs and walking practically barefoot and helping the pilgrims who would be going there and possibly receiving the Eucharist and the sacrament of reconciliation from the Franciscan friars who were responsible for the main locations for the Christians in the Holy Land. So that was his project of imitating Jesus. And so Ignatius undertakes his pilgrimage to Jerusalem. So he goes first to the Abbey of Montserrat near Barcelona. Then he spends some time in Manresa near Montserrat, again in the Barcelona area. He will spend practically 1 year there to deepen the spiritual dimension of his life, and he will make major experiences of God and enter in conversation with other people who themselves have an experience of God. And then, of course, after several twists and turns, it's difficult to be recognized, to find the money, share what he has with poor people, getting a passage, because once you're in Venice, you need to find a ship to sail up to Jerusalem. And finally, Ignatius gets to Jerusalem and presents his project to the Franciscans, and they tell them, well, Ignatius, go back to Europe. So his plan of living like Christ in poverty and serving the pilgrims who were going to the Holy Land and the people who were living there, no, they tell him, no, it's practically a point of no return. He needs to go back to Europe, and there he'll wonder what to do. So, of course, he's making a major pilgrimage. It's something that is impacting him. It's the only long pilgrimage that Ignatius will do, and it's a point of no return. He will have to go back to Europe. He will never return to Jerusalem. And it's in Europe that he will undertake a different kind of pilgrimage. Instead of trying to imitate Christ in an almost immediate fashion by living in Jerusalem, by living very poorly, he thought, what is God calling me to? What should I be doing? And this starts a different kind of pilgrimage for him. And he asks himself, what does God want for me? And that's how he decides to begin studies, to become a priest. So he has to start practically from scratch, needs to learn Latin, then will go to the university, first in Alcala, in Salamanca, and finally in the university in Paris. While doing that, he has companions and friends that he talks about his projects with them. And this affirms his way of accompanying people through the spiritual exercises, and he clarifies his own vocational project. And so much so that when he comes near Rome, in a small chapel, La Storta, it's a location called La Storta where there's a little chapel. There he has a vision of God, the Father places him with Christ bearing his cross, and the Father tells him, I shall be favorable to you in Rome. So for Ignatius, it's the confirmation after many years of studies and preparation that, yes, this is the destination that God has in mind for him. So it's a long pilgrimage, well, geographically, physically, but also internally, spiritually. This pilgrimage leads him to Rome and makes him a companion of Jesus. So first there was the pilgrimage to Jerusalem, pilgrimage of imitation, then a second pilgrimage that takes him to Rome with a new identity. Now the pilgrimage will go on, but in an interior fashion. Ignatius will continue to look for God, to search for God through prayer, but also through his ministry in Rome. He was taking care of the Society of Jesus, the Jesuits, but he was also doing ministry with the prostitutes at the St. Martha house. He was working with converts, was preaching, and so on. So in his daily life, through prayer and through action, he was looking for and finding God. So he was a pilgrim, but almost an motionless pilgrim, because he will be spending all those years in Rome without moving practically. So the pilgrimage is fully internalized. So in this sense, Ignatius is an interesting figure of a pilgrim, because he describes himself as a pilgrim, and he's talking about different kinds, different levels of pilgrimage. A second Ignatian way of living the pilgrimage is as a formation tool. So a few words on the context. The first Jesuit companions had the desire of living an apostolic life, a life like the apostles, a life on the way, going from one place to another in order to respond to the needs for preaching, for teaching, for bringing reconciliation in places where there were tensions. So there was that idea of having ministries on the move, where people were going to different places. Think of someone like St. Francis Xavier. He went to Asia, and precisely it's an example of this ministry that is on the move. This finds its origins in the Gospels. Jesus himself was a pilgrim. He was moving from one place to another and going to Jerusalem. He had not been born there, but that's where he died and was risen. But it was like a magnet, a destination for Christ himself. When we think of the Eucharist, Mass, it was like a pilgrim's meal that Jesus celebrated at the time of the Passover. He was a pilgrim in Jerusalem when he was arrested. So this element is present in the gospel, and Jesus himself sends his disciples as pilgrims. When he says in the gospels, go, and with no money, and with only a pair of sandals, and don't take a second tunic, and go and proclaim the good news. When you're well received, or stay, and if you're not received, go to a different place, go ahead, move. This whole idea of enthusiastic movement with limited means, this is at the core of the gospel. You have one of those missionary sendings in the chapter 10 of Gospel according to Luke. But you see this The same thing in the Acts of the Apostles and the life of the first Christian communities after Jesus' ascension. The first Christian communities where there is plenty of movements. Sometimes the communities is dispelled, but in the figure of Paul, you see the desire to go to new places, to go to Corinth or to Thessalonica or even to Rome. So the desire to proclaim the good news, to bring the message, and to be on their way. And you see God that pushes to move. God pushes to something new in the world and in the life of the community. So how does the pilgrimage in Ignatian mode become a tool of formation? Well, we have seen that pilgrimage was important for Ignatius himself in his personal experience. So he wanted the people who wanted to become Jesuits, who would like to become Ignatian, well, those people to also have this experience of the pilgrimage, because it was saying something important about this way of life following Jesus. So in the period that we call the novitiate, it's a 2-year period that is the beginning of the Jesuit religious life. There are a certain number of experiments that are especially important. And from the start, Ignatius was contemplating 3 major experiments. So 1 month to serve the poor in an institution like a hospital. So a charitable service to the poor, then 1 month of spiritual exercises, so retreat and silence, and we'll come back to that, and another month in pilgrimage. And I give you a quotation from the Constitution, so it's my translation, it's not the official translation, but it tells what is expected from that experiment that is presented to the young men who want to become Jesuits. So I quote, "The third experience is to spend another month in making a pilgrimage without money and even in begging from door to door at appropriate times for the love of God our Lord, in order to grow accustomed to discomfort in food and lodging. Thus, to the candidate, through abandoning all the reliance which he could have in money or other created things, may, with genuine faith and intense love, place his reliance entirely in his Creator and Lord." End of quote. So we see this desire of asceticism, of simplicity, the desire to put one's trust, one's reliance in God. So leaving as a pilgrim is accepting not to have means at his disposal, accepting to go and entrusting oneself to Providence, who is represented by the people around us, who may, well, give some money, some food, who house you for a shorter or longer period of time. But this experience of pilgrimage is an experiment that's still being done today. So the novices in various countries are invited to go to live for 2-3 weeks, a month, either without money or with a very small amount, and with a specific destination, but or not eventually, to make themselves vulnerable, to open themselves to different possibilities, and also to be open to encounters. So if you have an opportunity to talk with the Jesuit, eventually you could ask him first if he had the opportunity of making a pilgrimage during his novitiate. So unfortunately, it's not the case everywhere in all novitiates today, but if he had this experience, you could ask him where he went and what the fruit of this pilgrimage was for him. So some people went in pilgrimage to Guadalupe, to Mexico, and of course they had to collect the money for their travel. Others may have been living like homeless people in their own city, so to share the experience of people who are deprived and disadvantaged, not by their own choice. So there are different models of pilgrimage that are being done even today by the Jesuit novices, and that make this experience possible, this way of developing trust and reliance on God. A third way, a third Ignatian locus of pilgrimage is through spirituality, through the spiritual exercises. So you may be surprised, but a few years ago when I organized an evening on pilgrimage with a Christian community, a few people had made a pilgrimage in different locations, locally or even internationally. But when we talked about the characteristics of the pilgrimage, several people had had a deep spiritual experience that was similar to the pilgrimage, but in a spiritual center, either in a retreat center like the Villa Saint-Martin in Montreal, or in an abbey like Saint-Benoît-du-Lac in the eastern townships, for instance. So, I mean, a spiritual center or an abbey are very stable locations. One doesn't move, but there was some internal movement. First, you had to go over there, but there was especially this internal movement, this internal transformation by encountering other people and by having a deep encounter. So there's a connection between the fact of getting on the move physically, but also the fact of getting on the move spiritually in a different kind of incarnation or embodiment while encountering other people. So a fine example of this dialectics between interiority and exteriority in the pilgrimage, so the internal spiritual dimension and the physical movement or walk, is found in the way of a pilgrim. So it's very interesting work to read. It's a classic of Orthodox spirituality. So you have a pilgrim, a Russian pilgrim, who is both looking for holy places. He wants to go to Irkutsk, to Kiev. He eventually wants to go to Jerusalem. So looking for shrines, churches, and physical pilgrimage locations that are recognized. So pilgrim is on the move, but at the same time, and maybe first and foremost, looking for the continuous ongoing prayer. So he feels compelled by St. Paul's invitation to pray without ceasing. So he's asking himself, how can I pray without ceasing? He needs to work, he needs to move. For him, this is an internal quest, this question of praying without ceasing. So in the narrative. He meets with spiritual advisors. He meets with people who are also practicing prayer and people of different social classes who are charitable. You have landowners, church people, and those different people are accompanying him for some time, shorter or longer, in his quest for this prayer without ceasing. So all along this tale, we see how he meets other people. He's being helped by other people. He's also helping other people himself in his journey that is combining the desire of internal transformation, the internal quest, and the fact of being on the move, of being attracted by the destination, being looking for transcendence. In the Protestant world, and it's interesting to see that the pilgrimage is mainly considered as an internal process. Because of the 16th century Reformation, the reformers had some kind of aversion for the physical pilgrimage. They were considering it as something too popular, in a way, tied to the indulgences. So at some point there was some rejection of it. Of course, the acts of charity and prayer don't require any movement, so it's possible to be charitable and to be praying in the place where one lives. So pilgrimages are not necessary. But at the same time, Protestant piety did integrate the pilgrimage, but precisely as a spiritual dimension. The genuine pilgrimage is the interior pilgrimage. For both Catholics and Orthodox Christians, as we see in the story of the Russian pilgrim and in Ignatius's Pilgrim's Testament, there is a combination of both the internal dimension and the embodied dimension of the physical pilgrimage. So for the internal dimension, the spiritual exercises of St. Ignatius are chartering a way. There is a destination to the spiritual exercises. One is going to a certain place, a place where you encounter the Lord. A way is being designed or chartered, so the exercises are divided in weeks. There are different steps along the way. One first step that is about being anchored in God's love and in our own human reality that is sometimes broken and waiting for reconciliation. So there is this first step of reconciliation as we consider our genuine nature as beloved sons and daughters of God. Then there's a second week, a second stage, where we walk with Jesus. We are with him. We look at him as he's doing miracles, preaching the good news. Jesus is himself going from place to place, who meets different people, who's active. So the internal pilgrim doing the spiritual exercises is also invited to journey with Jesus, to go to those different locations and finding his own place. It's interesting to notice that the spiritual exercises are always being done with someone. There's always someone else who's accompanying the retreatant. It's not someone who gives us the way to follow, but that person, men or women, is accompanying us along the way. There's also a third week where we go to Jerusalem up to the Holy Week, when Jesus is being arrested. Well, before that, of course, there was the first Eucharist, the Last Supper, the crucifixion. And so we spend this time, this dramatic but stable time with Jesus. And then we go on with the fourth week. Jesus is appearing to different groups and different locations, to the disciples. And at the end of the exercises, we have gone all this way and we're invited to continue. It's not enough to say, well, I made that experience, been there, done that. No, it's about being transformed by this internal pilgrimage with Jesus, with other people. I'm not the first one to do that. There are other companions around me, other Christians, women and men, who are also following Christ, who want to journey with him and open themselves to a broader horizon. So after the retreat, one needs to continue living by it. So finding one's place to in the physical or exterior dimensions, we can embody what had been first experienced internally. So it's an invitation to a transforming experience that's combining interiority and exteriority. One of the means offered by Ignatian spirituality, and we see it in the context of the spiritual exercises, is what is called the prayer of alliance or the examination. It's about taking some time, at least once a day, to reread one's experience, to see how God was present in a given period of time. If it's a daily examination, it can be at the end of the day. And so you look how God was present in to our person, to our world during the day. Were there any moments where through the events, through the persons I met, where I could feel or see the presence of the Lord? So as to be aware that we are in pilgrimage. I'm a pilgrim with the Lord, and the Lord is walking with me. The Lord is journeying with us. As Christians, this Ignatian type of pilgrimage puts us in relation with a long tradition. First, God came to live amongst us. He pitched his tent among us. God chose to become a human being and to show himself to us, to call us to him. And it connects us also with the chosen people, the Jewish people, who was accompanied in their own journey by the Lord in their liberation as they left the land of Egypt to go through the promised land. So it's also as a people that we are called to walk to the Lord. So the spiritual dimension through the spiritual exercises of Ignatius are helping us to combine the internal dimension of our journey and the very embodied physical dimension of the pilgrimage. To conclude, possibly a few suggestions or advice for this Ignatian type of pilgrimage. And for us, as I said, this invitation to a combination, an alliance between what's external and what's interior. Being on the way, if you go for very embody the pilgrimage to Midland or Saint Anne de Beaupré or to Fatima in a different location. Well, this should be combined with an internal journey. So there's an alliance between the internal pilgrimage and the external dimension. Just as when we are doing an internal journey, there's an invitation to translate this internal journey in practical, concrete fruit in our daily lives.
Visible, qu'elle soit manifestée par
As visible and manifested in outside. And that's where we move and move somewhere. Another element, the question, what is the destination? We know where the pilgrimage invites us to, the destination where we want to go to. So what destination is mine? There can be a physical destination that we want to visit, but here again, within, what is the thing that draws me, with that God that draws me? How do I want to allow myself to be drawn, carried toward this God? How am I going to continue to seek this God, not just simply say, stop, because I've come to a physical place? Another concept also is the importance of the encounter. In other words, even when we go alone in a pilgrimage, the internal pilgrimage or the outside pilgrimage, or in flesh, there are other people who are accompanying us. Other people will be present. Other people will be important and contribute to this pilgrimage. Sometimes even people that we carry in our prayer, people who are hurting, but also the many other pilgrims that have passed before me, the crowd of saints that are honored in all kinds of places of pilgrimage. So we're not alone in the pilgrimage. We are invited to the meeting, in an encounter in a broad way, to meet other pilgrims who are at our sides. So the people who help us on the path, on the road, and when we get to our destination. The prayer of alliance, the exam is something, it's a way to anchor us into our daily experience, in our pilgrim experience, be it a physical, concrete pilgrimage from A to B, or the eternal pilgrimage of our experience of life that spreads out over many years. So the prayer of the Alliance prayer, by rereading our lives, looking at the events and giving thanks to God for what the Lord has allowed it to experience, well, that is an occasion for us to anchor our pilgrimage in a very specific way, to anchor it in the present time, but also in the movement over time, because each day is different from the other, and that the Lord constantly invites us to grow. To see also, and this is important, the fact that our identity is in movement. Our identity is not registered in a time or space given, time and space, even if we're open to this discovery. We've talked about vulnerability. We're invited to grow, to be on the road, to be in movement. This is for us individually, collectively also, as a country, as a family, as a church, also. We are pilgrims. We are in movement. There is change, and the Holy Spirit is the one who invites us to bring about this change and this newness, and which gives us life. Finally, we see that the pilgrimage invites us to transform something, to see what are the fruit that this experience gives us in the same way that we can go to Rome or Jerusalem and to Lourdes, and it can be simply a trip, just a trip, and that's good. We will have discovered things, we will have learned things, but we won't necessarily be transformed. At the heart of the pilgrimage is his desire that it not simply be a parenthesis, but that it bring about some form of transformation, a deep transformation of our being in the same way that we pray, reading texts, spiritual texts, or the Word of God, of participating in the sacraments. These are all invitations to transformation. So this is needed. And we ask ourselves the question, so that our pilgrimage, both inner and outer, that they carry fruit, be fruitful. So I think in this way, so we can see there's a certain Ignatian coloration that we can give to the pilgrimage, which helps us to make this experience an experience that be fruitful. Thank you, Father Brouillette, for having accompanied us through important moments of the pilgrimage, both inner and outer. I would like to invite people now to ask their questions in the the Q&A box, so that André will be able to answer. Well, the first question here, yourself, have you undertaken a pilgrimage? And could you tell us your experience, both at the spiritual and physical level? Well, yes, thank you. Yes, I've done different pilgrimages. Some were short, so they're not going to be very impressive. One day, for example, in the same city. But I walked part of the Compostela trip with colleagues in a very specific goal. But I have an experience related to where there was walking, hitchhiking, bus over 2 weeks' time. It was important for me because in the novitiate that I had, we didn't experience pilgrimage necessarily at the time. So I did this a bit later in Paris, and I went from Paris to Loyola, going through other little places where of pilgrimage, the Lourdes, for example. And then I continued towards Montserrat, Barcelona, and in Paris. Well, Paris, this was part from Paris to Chartres. I had to walk and did hitchhiking and things like that, and walk, and a bus. A certain number of things impressed me. I remember a lot of conversations with people, either with whom I had walked for a time or hitchhiked, as other hitchhikers with which I was traveling, or other people who have welcomed me in their car to discuss something that was very funny. It was a lady once from Lourdes towards Loyola, a lady took me in her car, and she started talking to me about the spiritual exercises of Saint Ignace. So I had found that very interesting. And I said, maybe good for you to do a retreat. She was impressed that I had done the 30 days. So I think these meetings are done along the road, and that I was able to experience in a given place. And when I entered Loyola, it's an important place, of course, of the Jesuits. Their birthplace. It's a place of conversion of our founder. So the chapel, the chapel of the conversation, the room where Ignatius lived his experience of conversion, that's rather important for the Jesuits and for me as a young Jesuit. So it was a destination that really talked a lot to me in terms of pilgrimage. So that was an experience that was spread out over time. There are other experiences that are more specific, but that's one of the experiences that I had that really influenced me enormously. and with the meetings, that's the importance of the place, but also the people who meet on the road. What a question here on the same topic. Do you think the pilgrimage was fruitful even now, many years after? Yes, we would hope that yes. For example, it's been many years now. It was the only time where I went to Loyola and Manresa. There's something that remains from all of this. But another thing that was fruitful is the fact to know ourselves better. Sometimes when we go on a pilgrimage, I saw some of my limitations there in a very, very specific way. The fact of having to, I had a bit of money, for example. I didn't have much, but I had a little bit of money. But sometimes a certain shyness to ask or to be in a position, to put ourselves in a position of vulnerability without money. I retained that for myself and I said, aha, there's something here where I was called to grow and appreciate, to allow myself to be transformed, because it's rarely a position that I choose to make myself vulnerable. So for me, that was really something that wasn't easy. Many years later, I still acknowledge that this is part of who I am in my personality. Have you met dangerous situations or difficult situations during the pilgrimage? And what does this say about God? Dangerous? I mean, sometimes we slept under the stars. Might have been a certain danger, but when you're young, we're not aware of all this. So that wasn't really an extreme danger. Some things that were disagreeable, the fact of being on the side of the road, waiting for hours before being able to go forth, that can be painful. No, there were moments where, especially if there's not many cars on the road, and you have to wait for, you're doing hitchhiking during wire hours. So that was part of the experience. We're not always well received either in some requests that we make. But I mean, that's part of the experience of vulnerability. My little experience is, even the whole experience was positive, but there might be some elements that were more difficult, for sure. You talked about the St. Joseph Oratory. Somebody's asking, what are the most beautiful pilgrimage places in Canada West, in the western part of Canada? Well, I don't know the Canadian West very much. But it's also in the context, or even North American context, it's because of the cycles of colonization. Most of the pilgrimage sites, important sites in Canada, are in Quebec. St. Joseph Oratory, Our Lady of the Cap, Saint Anne de Beaupré, which is even older. The Canadian Martyrs in Midland. Then we can continue with other places, Lac Boucher and other places. But those are the main places of pilgrimage, and they're mostly here. And the main basilicas are in the east of Canada. So I can't answer for the Canadian West what would be the best places, or the places that are the most involved, because I don't know enough, and they might not have the reputation as broad as some places of pilgrimage that we find in the eastern part of Canada. Which is rather interesting is to see that even in the States, there are not very many equivalents in the States to have places like the Oratoire, the St. Joseph Oratory, or Notre-Dame-du-Cap, Our Lady of the Cap, and Saint-Anne-de-Beaupré. So even Catholics from the Northeast states come traditionally to Quebec to undertake the pilgrimage. So sometimes the development of the pilgrimage areas or places for popular purposes is not necessarily geographically allocated on the territory. I read in the comments here the Saint Anne, the Lake Saint Anne in Alberta for the First Nations, very important place. In the circular pilgrim, how do we come into ourselves? Well, the first question is, normally the pilgrimage is there's a return. The pilgrim, when it goes to the place, destination, in a traditional definition of the pilgrimage, we go to a place, a pilgrimage, you go somewhere. Even the medieval pilgrims went to Jerusalem. They wanted to come back. So if you leave from Europe to Jerusalem in the Middle Ages, something happens, the boat sinks, or sickness or whatever, because we're talking about many months of displacement of moving. But normally the pilgrim comes back home. The pilgrim returns to their home, and that's why we hope that there's that transformation is perceived by, and the pilgrim is transformed by the experience they have had. That's the first concept of pilgrimage. You go out and you come back. So that's circular. But there's some pilgrimages that are circular in that you move between different sites, either in the same city or in the same region. You don't go out in a linear way to a given place and come back, but you circulate between different places. In Rome, for example, there's the possibility of circulate between 7 churches in Rome, some pilgrimages between the 7 churches in Roman churches, and pilgrimages also in Ireland, where you go to a given place and then you circulate, or different places that are very close one to another, and then you come back to your point of departure. So there's that possibility also as pilgrim, which is a bit less current. What it highlights is the internal dimension of the pilgrimage. So like when we have the labyrinth in Chartres, for example, the cathedral that we reproduced in these labyrinths, you walk within the same place, which symbolizes a displacement, but also a displacement that was within also, rather just being linear, going to a given and then coming back, going out and coming back. Could you comment the pilgrimages that are not geographic, but social displacement, and when we meet people from different contexts, where we meet people who, for example, who are suffering or other social circumstances? Yes. Well, I think that's a comment of a certain way more than a question. You're saying that there's a certain plasticity in the image of the pilgrim, that is adapted to different contexts, to different places, in that the pilgrimage is physical. That's the first element that we have. But there's also a pilgrimage that can be more spiritual, where we don't move. where we retired, or when we retreat house, so we do spiritual exercises. But there are other types of pilgrimages that can use the metaphor and insist on the different elements. The question of the comment here suggests is the question of encounter, the community, even the recomposition of the community that occurs in the context of these pilgrimage. There are other instances of encounter that help us to deepen the knowledge of the other, who makes us vulnerable. It opens us to the encounter with other, and it could be fruitful. Yeah, it could be a certain form of experience of pilgrimage. The Church of Bathurst is also a place for pilgrimage. Yes, sometimes there are places like that that can be, because of the historic importance of the place as a national hearth or a place of faith. Yeah, I think this is a good example. And it's also a place which is very historical in Bathurst. It's not the same period as the sanctuaries we're talking about in the east part of Quebec, in the Quebec. Participants said they participated in a pilgrimage in the World Youth Day in Paris that enriched their faith and their love of God. Do you think pilgrimages are still relevant for young people today, and why? Yes, the answer is in the question. But two things here. The World Youth Days, which were undertaken by Pope John Paul II, which gathers hundreds, thousands, and even millions of participants every two or 3 years. These days were presented at the very beginning as pilgrimages, as places where people gathered, where you go with others. You can go alone, but of course you won't remain alone very long, because you'll find yourself with 100,000 people and other persons in conditions that are often very simple, very austere in terms of living conditions, and allow an encounter with the Holy Father, with other pilgrims, and in a place that is where there's throughout the world. It'll be next year in Lisbon, in Portugal. And that pilgrimage is for young people. So you're young adults who are Catholic, maybe you're not. These are occasions that are very important to allow the young people to move, to go to some place, but also to encounter, to meet other persons, and to deepen their faith. On the broader question, this is the second element, on youth and pilgrimages, when we go on the St. James of Compostela, for example, for people who come from north, people are much more aged, because there's a question of costs, how to get to the Compostela. But when you see the young people from Spain, France, Italy, there's usually very young people who go. Well, I say young, as young, youth is relative. Anyway, people who are younger, in the 20s, university age, or a bit more, and they leave alone or by groups. They walk on the road of Saint Jacques, because the enthusiasm of an activity that's very enfleshed, embodied. So it's like almost a meeting. So there's the dimension of faith, or at least questing, looking for something that goes beyond the life of many of these pilgrims. And so there's a certain energy in the fact of moving, of going, meeting, touch, to go and see. And when people do this, as they say, trips form youth. So I think pilgrimages do that. Pilgrimages do the same thing. This is a way of moving, of growing, of being on the road in one's faith, and on the road with others. So, as I said, to be in link, to be connected to all those who preceded us, those who walked, who preceded us, and those who preceded us in a given place where we're going, or if it's the tomb of a saint. So there's that link that nourishes us and helps us to define the identity of the person for the future. For the young people, I think it's a particularly privileged moment to live out an experience of pilgrimage, a pilgrimage that requires a certain physical effort. So it's a good time to do it when you're young. But that could be beneficial at all age. But it's quite clear it's for younger people. We see it at the university where I teach as a course on pilgrimage even each year, and there are often tens of students that have put on a reserve list because the number of places are all filled up. But so it attracts a lot. Just to conclude, why write a book on the pilgrimage? Well, the book that I wrote, and I talked about at the very beginning, the paradigm, the origin is in the fact that the Church in Vatican II in the 60s talked about being a pilgrim church, a church on the road. And so I wanted to see how this idea, where it came from, first of all, and also what it meant. So it's the last chapter, but if you back up, I analyzed that image of the pilgrimage for Ignatius, for whom it's very important, even in terms of formation, and also to see the phenomenon of pilgrimage, which is very popular today, be it in a Christian context or in a secular context. Many people, Quebecers, for example, that go to St. James of Compostela, do it for secular reasons. They do it for health reasons, but not for religious reasons. There's something that challenges us, questions us, and I want to check it out. For example, by some people say, and what does it imply for the Church? That there's this interest for the mobility and growth and the collective growth. How do these elements of the pilgrimage, how can they help us to be transformed as individual, but also as people or as Church? So that I would say that's what I had in mind when I wrote the book on pilgrimage. So I thank you very much, Father Brouillette. Thank you for everything you shared and for all this experience that you have personally. And before